Bilefsky. So there was some miscommunication. I mean, I'm explaining him कि वो कैसे ज्वाइन कर सकते हैं मुझे इंस्टाग्राम लाइव पे. Hello, sir. Okay, then.
Now you can see, sorry about my technological ineptness. I'm showing my lack of millennial status. I'm trying to be connected.
No worries, but sir, thank you so much for giving us your time. I mean, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I have read your articles and I have so many questions to discuss with you about the articles you write for the New York Times.
My pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So, sir, to start with, like you have covered multiple elections, the rise of Europe's rights and the terrorist attack. So, tell us, according to you, what constitutes a good story? Like what are the elements apart from who, why, where? What is essential to write a good story?
Well, the common denominator of any good story is action and human beings. So most stories are personality driven. At the end of the day, whether you're covering, upheaval in India or a terrorist attack in France or human rights in Canada, the common denominator of any story is people and character. So as a journalist, that's always what you're looking for, to excavate a human narrative.
Okay. But sir, when you say that people are at the center of a good story, then as a crime reporter, how do you approach people? Because many a times you become so immune to the crime scene that you lose that empathy level to which you should talk to victims. So how do you maintain that human level and also that level of reporter? I mean, how do you balance both?
As you mentioned, I've covered, at least a dozen terrorist attacks, and I also wrote a true crime thriller about a group of Beijing thieves in London who stole about $22 million worth of gold, gems, and cash and security deposit. I mean, the moment you lose your humanity as a journalist, and your empathy, you're really in trouble.
You're really in trouble?
Yeah,
okay.
I mean, it's possible to be balanced and accurate and to still have empathy.
Okay.
You can go both sides of the story. But, when you're at the Bataclan massacre in Paris where I was, and, blood is flowing on the floors, it's impossible as a human being not to feel empathy, but that doesn't negate the fact that you're a journalist and you have to be rigorous with the facts, with accuracy and with balance. So, I mean, it's maintaining your humanity as a journalist is the most important thing.
Okay. And it's, when you are covering crime or when you're covering any beat in journalism, how much is the freedom of speech given in Canada or in different places that you worked with? Because it is generally said that the freedom of speech for media, for journalists is really under danger. Do you believe so?
It is absolutely under danger. And, as a former correspondent in Turkey, operating under an authoritarian regime, where there was a pretty strong clampdown on media freedom. It's very different, obviously, being in a country like Canada, which is a democracy with, complete press freedom, where government officials and institutions are accountable.
Okay.
So, we don't have an issue with that. I mean, the main issue in Canada is probably that, the media scene is fairly small, I guess, even though we're a large country physically. I know India has a very competitive, vibrant scene, and that keeps officials to account when you have a lot of different newspapers, a lot of different media organs. Here we have the main national broadcaster, the CBC, and there are very few national newspapers. There's one in Toronto, the Globe and Mail, which provides a newspaper like the New York Times a real window to operate, because there are not that many media with international perspectives.
Okay. And sir, one of the a very different element about your stories is to have a counterintuitive aspect that you bring in all of your stories. Like I was just reading this how millions of Spanish men are using Viagra, and you just connected it with their economy, and that was just brilliant. I mean, no one would have thought about it. I mean, so tell us, how do you bring this element? I mean, something which is not commonsensical, but going ahead of it.
Well, I think, every journalist has his or her sensibilities. One of my sensibilities, since I started off in my early 20s, was to always be attracted to stories that are unexpected. And sometimes that means covering things on the margins of culture. But it's much more interesting and dynamic to find a window into a country through something unexpected. So you mentioned the Viagra story. At that
Yeah.
time, I was in Brussels as a European Union correspondent for the New York Times. And I had a very dear friend who was a journalist from a Spanish newspaper who was very depressed. And I asked her why she was depressed, and she said, she was having problems with her boyfriend. And I asked her why. And she said, he was struggling sexually, and he was taking Viagra. And she said, come to think of it, my father's taking Viagra, my grandfather's taking Viagra, and I kind of came back to my office and I called Pfizer, the maker of Viagra, and I asked them to send me the numbers for Europe. I saw
Okay.
that Spain was
Was it the?
vertical access, and so I thought, interesting. I wonder why so many Spanish men are taking Viagra. So often stories come about, through conversations with the water cooler, and then indeed I set off to Spain, where I talked to sociologists and sexologists and local young people to try and understand what was it about Spain at that particular moment that was making men use Viagra. And there were many interesting explanations, including feminism, that the men were feeling emasculated, impotent. There was also the party culture of Spain, where people go clubbing all night and then drugs. So it's about always trying to find an interesting way to tell the story.
But so there is a lot of pressure in the newsroom that you have to come up with a news story every single day. So do you work under such pressure, or you have the luxury of time to work on your story for a week or even longer?
It's a mix of both. I mean, the New York Times has a very fast 24/7 operation, and we're constantly updating our website. So as foreign correspondents, we're responsible to make sure that we are on top of the news in real time. At the same time, people turn to the New York Times because we do added value, analytical, investigative, big picture journalism, and those kinds of stories take time. For example, I've recently been looking at the situation in long-term care facilities in Canada, which are suffering hugely under the coronavirus. Looking at particularly the fact that asylum seekers and immigrant refugees are working as healthcare workers on the front lines, which is a debate here on immigration policy, because some people are suggesting that these people risking their lives in these long-term care facilities should be given asylum. So a story like that, for example, you're not going to do an hour or 2 hours.
It will take.
Getting back to the first point, if you want to get to the humanity, you need to spend time with them to get to know them.
Okay. And so you have covered like so many stories, but what drew you to this Hilton Garden burglary, the largest burglary in British legal history? Like you wrote a whole book on it. So what was so fascinating about it?
Well, I mean, what's not to love about a group of geriatric criminals in their 70s who came out of retirement and undertook this elaborate jewel heist? So I think immediately it sounded like a Hollywood film, a bit like
a good script for a film. Yeah,
like Ocean's 11 meets geriatric. So I was amazed. I was instantly drawn to the story because of its narrative possibility, because of these amazing characters. I mean, these are old guys, some of whom suffered from every ailment from diabetes to the continent, who were jumping down elevator shafts in the 70s. I think the other thing that was very attractive to me was Scotland Yard was secretly, the British police was secretly eavesdropping on the criminals and reporting them as they were plotting the crime and in the aftermath. And I got my hand on some of that audio. So the cinematic possibilities of recreating those scenes of these old guys plotting and in the aftermath of the crime, from a writer's point of view, it was very attractive.
But sir, how did you make sure that you give information which is not already out there, because it was covered by various media publications? So
Yeah.
how do you differentiate yourself?
Oh, well, the way you differentiate yourself is
Hmm.
getting access to primary sources. So in that
Okay.
case, I had access to the leading Scotland Yard police officers on the case. I got access to some of the secret audio that was
Yeah.
taken of guys as they were in their cars. So yeah, when you're dealing with a very high-profile story like that everyone else is covering, you need to find that added value, that secret sauce that's going to make people want to read your version of events. And in my case, it was getting access to some of the main characters.
Okay. Okay. And so you have like worked in different countries, different cities, from Paris to Montreal to Prague. So tell me, how do you dabble with different cultures? How do you make sure that you bring out the best stories from in spite of being an outsider in most of the countries, cities?
Well, actually, being an outsider is a great advantage as a foreign correspondent. I mean, if you're encountering a multifaceted, very complicated country like India, for example, if you have an outsider perspective, you're going to perhaps see things that other
In a
people
different
won't
way.
see. Yeah, you're not going to be as jaded by ideology and by prejudices. And you know, the
Okay.
nuts and bolts of being a journalist, of finding big stories, reporting upon them accurately, writing about them with flair, I mean, really transcends borders and is something you can apply in whatever country you're in. I mean, interestingly, I recently came back to Canada after 3 decades away, so I
Yeah.
have the weird dynamic of being both an insider because I grew up here and so I
Yeah,
understand
you
the
do.
smell and sensibility of the country. But because I've been away for so long, I really experience it as a foreign correspondent because even though I'm from here and I speak the languages of my country, you know, French and English, I haven't been around, and so I see things in a different way. So, for example, here you have culture clashes, language clashes, identity clashes, and you know, I see that with a different perspective because I've been away for so many years.
Okay. And it's really interesting to know, sir, that being an outsider works in your favor and not against. Like you just read things and you can access any country, any city that you would like to.
Yeah, I mean, when you have some distance, emotional and
Yeah.
physical, from a story or from a
You don't
country,
take things for granted.
you don't take things for granted. I mean, one of the most amazing things about being a foreign correspondent in India, for example, I mean, I've had friends of mine tell me, you know, there's a story in every tree. And I know some of the most exciting, my colleague Ellen Barry used to be in Delhi and cover India. I mean, she would just tell me how inspiring it was because as a foreigner, what may seem obvious, you know, to Indians, whether that's, you know, consumer culture, or in her case, she did this incredible story about a person who was living in an old castle in Delhi who turned out to be part of this fake dynasty. You know, this was a story that had been parsed by the Indian media for decades, and it took a New York Times reporter to come and discover it. So sometimes just having a new perspective and having that enthusiasm gives you
Yeah.
like a little edge.
Okay. And I was reading one of your interviews in which you said about one of the story that really stuck with you was the forced suicides of young girls in Turkey. So
Yes.
tell me, how does being a crime reporter impact you in your own personal life? Like, does it or does it not?
Of course it does. I mean, we're
Like,
human beings,
yeah.
even though we're journalists, and no matter how much of a kind of carapace you develop after covering very horrific events. I mean, in my case, I've covered at least a dozen terrorist attacks.
Yeah.
You know, I've interviewed hitmen and murderers and pedophiles and all range of human pathology. And you know, if you lose your humanity, if you lose your empathy, you cannot do your job as a journalist. And of course, sometimes you take that home with you. By the same token, of course, over the number of years of covering these very dramatic events, for example, terrorist attacks, where I'm often the person who interviews the families of victims, you do develop, you know, sort of like a doctor or a medical worker, you develop a certain inner toughness that allows you, at least in the moment, to overcome your
Yeah.
emotional response. When you go home at the end of the day, you may need a stiff drink or the support of loved ones. But it
Yeah.
kind of goes back to my original point, which is that you really need to retain your humanity.
Humanity. True. Yeah, and then I was reading an interview by Hussein Zaidi. He is a journalist based in Mumbai, and he's a crime reporter. He's written several books, and in his books, one of his books called Mafia Queens of Mumbai, he wrote about how many a times he becomes friends with criminals, and then he has to decide on where to draw the line. So does that happen to you? Because sometimes they are so nice to you, and you don't know. I mean, when to differentiate. Yeah.
It's a great question. While I was researching my book on this crime by this group of geriatric criminals, I was very interested in meeting Freddie Foreman, who was the grandfather of British crime. He'd been the hitman or the enforcer for the Krays, who were these diabolical twins who stalked London in the 1960s and 1970s. He was 84 at the time. He spent about 16 years in jail, and his job basically to get rid of the bodies, and he confessed murder publicly before. When I showed up at his door, he invited me in for a glass of wine. We spent hours and hours together, and it was very hard to square the affable grandfather in front of me with his very bloody history. He was also an incredibly brilliant raconteur and very brilliant, and it was very obvious to me that if he had been born in a different socioeconomic situation, he probably could have been prime minister, not one of Britain's most notorious criminals. So it's true. You do develop, human connections with people. I think in a way that makes you do better stories, because by developing that emotional connection, people are going to be more open to chatting with you. But as long as you kind of maintain the fact that you're a journalist and you maintain your adherence to the facts, and you maintain your balance, I mean, it's okay. I mean, you can still write about an aging hitman and write about their diabolical past and see them as maybe doddering grandfather that they become. I mean, humans are complex, and that doesn't necessarily negate developing like a human relationship with the person you're writing about. But it's a great question, because sometimes those lines can...
Definitely. And then what do you have to say about organized crime? Because that's the thing I see a lot in India. Where sometimes the government is indulging in it and there's nothing you can do about it.
What aspect of organized crime are you asking about?
No, I mean, what are your views on organized crime, maybe in Canada, or have you encountered it as a journalist? And because there's nothing you can do about it. You see the officials, the bureaucrats indulging in crime, indulging in corruption, but you don't have the power to write about it.
That's a very interesting question. I mean, where I'm sitting in Montreal in Canada, which is this francophone cosmopolitan city, there's a very long history of organized crime, with the mafia being very entrenched here and smuggling drugs and becoming kind of a global epicenter for drug smuggling and cocaine smuggling, particularly in the 1980s. It is extremely hard to report those stories because it's extremely dangerous, obviously. Talking about violent protagonists. So you can cultivate the resources. In some cases, if you're very lucky, you can develop relationships with some people on the criminal end of things. But indeed, it's an extremely challenging and dangerous thing to do, and you have to calibrate your desire to cover fact with your desire for self-preservation. But I know many friends who are, investigative crime reporters who have developed relationships with people in organized crime, because often it serves their purposes to tell parts of their story as well.
Because I'll just tell you the scene here, that as a journalist, many a times I see that the editor wouldn't want you to write that story. There's a lot of pressure because many a times the newspaper is getting funding from a certain party. So most of the time, the most crucial story are the ones which remain with the reporter, which are not printed anywhere. So I think that's the sad...
Absolutely. Look, as a reporter, we're always hungry to find a story, and that drives, but you also have to weigh that against self-preservation. And often some things are just too dangerous to venture into.
Ventured into it, true. And tell me, in the times of COVID-19, when we see, like especially in India, I see that not people are going for newspapers, but they are going for digital platforms which provide news. So tell me the changing role of media during COVID-19. Do you see it?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the challenges of covering the coronavirus in the age of Twitter and social media, there's a lot of self-proclaimed citizen journalists out there. There's a lot of people getting information online. We're living in this time of abject paranoia and conspiracy theories, and when you have, the most powerful political man in the world, being a mask denier, and the president of Brazil, the biggest economy in Latin America, just yesterday it was announced that he had corona. Also, kind of brushing it off as a little more than a cold. So at a time when there's a lot of misinformation out there, as a journalist, it's more imperative than ever to be based on facts. And so I think, a newspaper like the New York Times, we have a global briefing every day where we distill the world coronavirus news, both in the United States and internationally. And, I think there's never been a time where there's more need for data and rigor and accuracy, because this pandemic is making us all a little bit crazy and a little bit frightened. And so people want to have real concrete information.
Okay. And then would you like to give us insights in any of your story where you discuss like how did you start and what was the process and what was the final product, to just give us an idea about how you work as a reporter?
Just generally speaking, or with regard to a particular story?
Regards to a particular story.
And is there any particular story you have in mind?
I guess where you spoke about Finland having existential crisis.
Well, this gets back to my original point, which is that I'm always trying to find a new way to tell a story. And at that time, I was living in Europe, and I went to Helsinki to do some stories. And around that time, there was this very strange heavy metal band called Lordi, who dressed up as kind of Frankenstein monsters and had exploding meat on stage. And were getting closer and closer to winning the Eurovision Song Contest. And Finland fashions itself as this very studious, economically vibrant, high-tech economy, the country of Nokia and Scandinavian furniture. And here they were being represented by this diabolical heavy metal band. And it gave the country an identity crisis. So when I got the story by basically hanging out in bars in Helsinki and speaking to people, and they kept mentioning this band Lordi. And so, it's weird enough to perhaps write about a strange heavy metal band who dressed like monsters, but the fact that it was giving the country an identity crisis and existential breakdown made the story much more delicious. So then I got on the phone and I tracked down the band, and they agreed to meet with me. And I actually met with them after they had won the Finnish Eurovision contest, but I think they went on to win the actual Eurovision Song Contest. My story went viral at the time, and it had a lot of follow-up. So I feel like I played my little role in helping to redeem Finland, because for years, Finland was known for getting 0 points, for being one of the worst performers in the Eurovision Song Contest. I'm not sure, is Eurovision popular in India?
No.
Not at all, okay. Eurovision is like this contest where different countries put forward bands to compete in this big competition. And a lot of these bands like ABBA, or Dion, got their start during the Eurovision Song Contest. It's a big celebration of Twitch.
Then I read this Finland story a long back, but I remembered it because it has sense of humor and it had a very strong point. Like, do you ever think twice before taking a really strong stand before any country or any person?
Well, first of all, I'm glad to hear that you still remember a story, because I think that story was almost more than 10 years ago.
10 years ago,
So, I think it's one of the things I appreciate about working for the New York Times is at least in features and enterprise stories and longer kinds of stories, there's a space to have your own voice, to write with flair, and to have a kind of writerly approach. But we're not operating in a vacuum. We have several layers of editors. And you have a voice, but if you're writing about news or if you're covering a particular event, obviously accuracy and balance is very important. And I have editors, who make sure that that balance and accuracy is maintained. So you can have a voice, but you're not, I'm not an editorial writer, I'm not an opinion writer, and I'm very trained. I've been at the New York Times for 15 years, so that kind of DNA of maintaining your objectivity, of sticking to the facts, of showing both sides of the story, are so ingrained that even if you're writing with a little bit of flair, hopefully, and color and verve and fun,
It would work.
You need to stick to the facts.
Okay. And if I'm not wrong, you have also dabbled with different beats of journalism, say not just crime, but you also share some soft feature stories on your social media. You don't write most of them, but yeah, you're just sharing the New York Times, what New York Times is publishing. So tell us, do you also like shift between different beats? Is that easy for you?
No, it's not easy at all. And in fact, one often says that a foreign correspondent knows something about everything, nothing about anything. But as a foreign correspondent, I've been in Paris, London, Brussels, Istanbul, Prague, New York as a reporter. When you're a foreign correspondent, you're expected to be responsible for everything that happens in the country.
Everything that happens, yeah.
Politics, economics, business, culture. Since I've been in Canada, I've written about everything from the identity politics of Putin, the mass shootings,
racism,
to the history of indigenous subjugation. So you have to be versatile as a journalist and as a foreign correspondent. You need to be able to, to be a jack of all trades.